Your four favorites are Meet Me in St. Louis, Coraline, Dead Poet Society, and It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown. Even though it's technically a series, not a movie, my mind immediately went to Over the Garden Wall because it's animated like Coraline and Charlie Brown. It has this cozy, sort of musical vibe like Meet Me in St. Louis. It's a dark fantasy like Coraline. It explores existential themes like Dead Poet Society, and it takes place around Halloween like It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown. I also think you'd like Pan's Labyrinth. It has a nostalgic, almost dreaminess to it, like Meet Me in St. Louis. Like Coraline, it's a dark fantasy from the perspective of a child. Like Dead Poet Society, it's about personal growth and finding your own voice with underlying themes related to resistance against oppressive forces. And like It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, it has this sort of autumn fantasy childhood vibe. Bridge to Terabithia, like Meet Me in St. Louis, centers around family. Like Coraline, it's a fantasy about childhood. Like Dead Poet Society, it's a coming of age story. And like It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, it has that childlike sense of wonder, but also an underlying feeling of melancholy. Since you've got some classics in your favorites, but also films from a child's perspective, I want to recommend The Night of the Hunter, which is a classic that really explores fear from the perspective of children. But your favorites also give off a sort of comfort movie vibe, and since two of your favorites are animated, an animated film that very much feels like a comfort movie that I think you'd enjoy is My Neighbor Totoro. Moonrise Kingdom is colorful and whimsical like Meet Me in St. Louis. It focuses on that childhood perspective like Coraline. It's a coming-of-age film like Dead Poets Society. And like It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, it has that childlike sense of wonder and feels tied to a season, except in this case, the season is summer instead of autumn. Cinema Paradiso, like Meet Me in St. Louis, is a classic that feels warm and nostalgic. Like Coraline, it feels like it captures the world through a child's eyes. Like Dead Poet Society, it's about growth, mentorship, and passion. But in this film, instead of a passion for literature, it's a passion for cinema. And like It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, it captures the innocence, longing, imagination, and wonder of youth. Where the Wild Things Are is also about childhood and involves the protagonist entering a fantasy world, sort of like Coraline. Since you've got a few classics in your favorites, but your favorites also kind of has a Halloween vibe. I know a lot of people consider Meet Me in St. Louis a Christmas movie, but it's also technically a Halloween movie. And Coraline is kind of a horror movie, so it's got that spooky season vibe. And obviously The Great Pumpkin is a Halloween movie. And since some of your favorites also feel like comfort films, with all that in mind, I want to recommend a feel-good classic Halloween movie, and that's Arsenic and Old Lace. Since you're a fan of Meet Me in St. Louis, another musical starring Judy Garland I think you'd enjoy is A Star is Born. Another musical from the director of Meet Me in St. Louis that you might like is An American in Paris. Since Meet Me in St. Louis is a musical and you've got a couple coming-of-age films or films from a childhood perspective in your favorites, a coming-of-age musical I think you'd enjoy is Sing Street. Since you like Coraline, I want to recommend James and the Giant Peach, which was also directed by Henry Selick. And it's kind of comparable to It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, because giant peach, great pumpkin, big fruit. And another stop-motion film I think you might enjoy since you like Coraline is Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, which is also a musical like Meet Me in St. Louis and a dark fantasy like Coraline. You didn't have Good Will Hunting marked as watch, but I think you'd enjoy this one, especially as a fan of Dead Poets Society, because Robin Williams also takes on that sort of mentor role in this one. But if you want another movie with that student-teacher sort of mentorship vibe, I think you might like Miss Stevens, and maybe The Edge of 17, although it might be a bit of a stretch to call the teacher in that one a mentor. For some reason, the fact that you have It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown in your favorites makes me want to recommend something that has that childlike sense of wonder, but also a feeling of simplicity and gentleness. Maybe it's because I also know you're a fan of the movie Flow. I feel like I'm not doing a good job articulating what I mean, but the films I was thinking of were Kes and The Red Balloon. I mentioned comfort movies multiple times in reference to your four favorites, and I feel like that especially rings true with It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown. But you didn't have one of the ultimate comfort movies marked as watched, and that's Paddington.